The evening light spilled across the city in hues of gold and amber, softening the jagged edges of towering skyscrapers and shimmering against the polished windows of a five-star restaurant perched above the bustling streets. Inside, a gentle murmur of conversation floated through the air, mingling with the faint strains of piano music and the delicate clinking of glassware. It was the kind of place reserved for milestones, anniversaries, promotions, the celebration of life's great moments. For Margaret, this dinner seemed like one of those milestones. Her son Daniel had called her earlier that week, his voice warm, almost eager in a way that stirred something hopeful inside her. "Mom, we'd love for you to join us for dinner this Saturday. Just the three of us. Somewhere special." He didn't elaborate, but Margaret didn't press. A mother knew when not to push. Instead, she tucked the invitation close to her heart, turning it over in her mind each night as she lay in her modest apartment, wondering if it was at last her birthday surprise, the one she hadn't dared to expect. Her birthday had slipped by quietly the year before, marked only by a phone call from Daniel, quick distracted, filled with excuses about work deadlines and next time. But now, as she smoothed the wrinkles from her best dress and clasped the old pearl necklace her late husband had given her decades ago, Margaret allowed herself to believe. Perhaps her son and his wife Claire were finally remembering how much she meant to them. Perhaps this dinner would be the evening she had always longed for, a reminder that her years of sacrifice, working double shifts, going without new clothes so Daniel could have his first computer-skipping vacations to pay for his education, had not been forgotten. The car ride to the restaurant was quiet, Daniel and Claire sitting in the front, murmuring to each other in tones Margaret couldn't quite catch. She stared out the window, the city lights streaking past, and told herself not to mind. They had grown distant, yes, but marriage and careers did that to young people. Tonight, surely things would be different. When they arrived, a waiter in a crisp black suit greeted them with a smile that was both professional and warm. "Good evening. Right this way." He led them through the grand dining hall, past tables dressed in white linen and polished silver, until they reached a corner table by the window. Margaret caught her breath at the view the city stretched endlessly below, glittering like 1,000 tiny stars. As they settled in, Daniel ordered a bottle of wine without consulting her. Claire smiled politely, her eyes sharp, calculating as if she were measuring every move. Margaret brushed it off. Young people these days, she thought, had forgotten the gentleness of simple courtesy. Still, she smiled, folding her hands neatly on the table, trying to match the elegance of the room. The first course arrived, delicate portions of food arranged like artwork. Margaret picked at it carefully, savoring each bite, though she couldn't help but notice how Daniel and Claire barely looked up from their hushed conversation. She reminded herself again that it didn't matter. Tonight was about family. Tonight was about being remembered. As the waiter refilled their glasses, Margaret leaned forward, her voice soft but filled with quiet hope. "This is such a lovely place. I can't remember the last time I've been somewhere like this." Daniel glanced at her briefly, a tight smile crossing his lips before vanishing as quickly as it appeared. "We thought it would be nice," he said simply, his eyes darting back to Claire. Something in his tone unsettled her. There was no warmth in it, no trace of the boy who once ran into her arms after every school play, beaming, as if her applause alone made him shine brighter. She shifted in her seat, glancing around at the other tables where couples laughed, freely, glasses raised in unguarded joy. But she pushed the unease aside. Surely the surprise would come soon. The cake, the candles, the whispered "Happy birthday, Mom." She imagined it so vividly that she almost smiled in anticipation. Then came the moment that nearly broke the illusion. The waiter returned, not with cake or champagne, but with a slim leather folder which he handed discreetly to Claire. She opened it quickly, sliding out a stack of neatly clipped papers. Her manicured nails tapped against the top sheet as she whispered something to Daniel, who nodded grimly. Margaret's heart skipped. Papers at dinner. She forced herself to look away, pretending she hadn't noticed, sipping her wine slowly to mask the tremor in her hands. Perhaps it was nothing. Work documents, maybe. Young couples always carried the weight of responsibility with them. Yes, that must be it. And yet the air shifted subtly, the easy illusion of celebration cracking at the edges. Margaret caught Claire glancing at her not warmly, not with affection, but with something sharper, colder, as though studying her for weakness. The piano music swelled, filling the silence that stretched too long at their table. Margaret set her fork down gently, folding her napkin in her lap, and took a deep breath. She had been through harder things in her life, the loneliness after her husband's death, the exhaustion of raising a child alone, the quiet dignity of surviving when no one was watching. Whatever this was, she would face it. Still in her heart, she clung desperately to the hope that perhaps she was mistaken, that the papers meant nothing, that any moment now a waiter would appear with a birthday cake, her son would smile, and the night would transform into what she had imagined all along, a celebration of love, family, and gratitude. For now, she waited, the flicker of hope still burning faintly, though a shadow of dread had begun to stretch across her heart. The second course came with ceremony, a silver-domed cover lifted to reveal a perfectly seared fish, each fillet crossing a brushstroke of herb sauce with such precision it looked painted. Steam drifted up fragrant and clean, and Margaret nodded her thanks to the waiter as if such elegance were her familiar companion. Across the table, Daniel cleared his throat and straightened his posture in a way that made him look older, not in years, but in burden. Claire rested her fingertips on the stack of papers like a pianist poised above keys. So, Claire began softly, each syllable polished. "How have you been feeling lately?" "Margaret Annie. Dizziness, trouble with the stairs." "You mentioned on the phone last week that the elevator in your building has been unreliable." Margaret felt the question catch like a burr. She smiled carefully. "It's an old building. Things break. I manage." "Of course," Claire said, breezy and cool. "We just worry. Daniel worries." Daniel looked at his hands. He had his father's hands, square capable, a touch of oil under the nail beds, no matter how he scrubbed back when he was a boy helping in the garage. He used to show those hands to her after a project, proud and smudged. Now he intertwined his fingers as if trying to keep them from doing anything on their own. "Mom," he said, "I know it's been a lot. Since the fall last winter." It was a slip she answered too quickly. "Wool socks and a polished floor. I was up again in seconds. You told me you needed to sit for a while," Daniel said, his voice softening. "You sounded scared." She could not deny that memory, the cold kiss of the floorboards, the sudden knowledge that bones could be treacherous things. But she had gotten up. She had brewed tea. She had hummed to fill the room with something besides her loneliness. "I was startled," she said. Startled, not defeated. She lifted her chin. "I wish you wouldn't speak to me as if I were already gone." The words dimmed the candlelight between them. Claire's smile tightened. "No one is suggesting that." The waiter arrived with a basket of warm bread, a flotilla of tiny plates, and a question about refilling their wine. He was young, almost boyish, with kind eyes that flicked over the table and registered the atmosphere with a tactful pause. "Another bottle?" he asked. "Or shall I bring sparkling water?" "Sparkling," Daniel said, as if declaring a compromise, and the waiter retreated. The papers glinted under the chandelier. Margaret tried not to look, but the neat black type seemed to hum at the corner of her vision. She made herself ask the script of questions she had practiced in her head since Daniel's invitation. "How is work? Are you still leading that team project? Claire did that conference in San Francisco. Go. Well, do you still do yoga on Saturdays?" Each inquiry met with courteous replies, efficient and polished, and none of them dwelt on her long enough to leave a mark. She had brought a small gift in her handbag, a scarf she had knitted in soft slate blue wool, the exact shade of Daniel's eyes when he laughed as a child. She had imagined presenting it with ceremony, but the moment kept slipping away, moving like a fish beneath water. Mom Daniel tried again, and he placed his palms flat on the table as if stilling a tremor in himself. "We've been talking about options, better support. The city can be hard, and you're on your own so much. We only want what's best." "What's best?" Margaret echoed, tasting the words like medicine. "For whom?" Claire jumped in before the silence could widen. "For you," she said. "For all of us, really." We've done a lot of research. There's a community on the river with gardens and art classes and a medical team on site. They're highly rated. She slid the papers closer as if they were a photograph of a brighter future. They have a wait list, but when we explained your situation, they agreed to hold a place. My situation, Margaret repeated, and this time she let the syllables ring. I live in my home. I tend my plants. I walk to the library. I bake on Sundays. I make my own tea. Tea doesn't keep you safe if you fall again, Claire said gently, as if laying down a quilt, something soft that could smother. And the neighborhood. You said there were men arguing outside the grocery last week. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, remembering the voices like knives. She had stood behind a rack of canned tomatoes, measuring the danger. She had waited for quiet, counted to 20, and stepped into the sunshine unharmed. Danger exists everywhere, she said. I am still myself. Something in Daniel's face trembled. You'll always be yourself, he said, and the words fell like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. The fish cooled on their plates. Around them, laughter rose and fell in easy waves from other tables, and the piano leaned into a familiar melody that made Margaret think of slow dancing in the kitchen, with her husband, a hand at her waist, a dish towel tossed carelessly over his shoulder. For a moment, she was 24 again, a young mother with flour on her cheek, and a boy who used her arms as his whole horizon. But when she opened her eyes, she saw only the papers and the way Claire held a pen poised like a verdict. What are those? Margaret asked finally, and she kept her voice steady. Claire didn't flinch. Information, she said. She spread the sheets delicately, pointing with the pen tip as if afraid to bruise anything. Housing agreement, medical release, power of no. Margaret said not loudly, but with a clarity that cut the air. The waiter, returning with sparkling water, hesitated and then set the bottle down as gently as if it were a newborn. His eyes flickered to Margaret, then to Daniel, and something like pity crossed his face before he masked it with professionalism. Margaret watched him go and wondered if he had a mother who had taught him how to pour without spilling a drop. Daniel rubbed his jaw. Mom, we're not trying to ambush you. We thought doing this at dinner would make it palatable, she offered, and a dry amusement surprised her. You thought the tablecloth would soften the blow. We thought it would be easier to talk, he said, looking wounded. If it felt like a special night. Birthday special, she asked, and the word landed like a stone. Claire blinked. You thought this was for your birthday? What else would I think? Margaret murmured. You didn't say why we were coming. You booked a place people come to celebrate, and you brought me to a window overlooking a city I helped you survive. Forgive me for thinking the reason was joy. Daniel closed his eyes in a pained wince. It was never meant to hurt you. Intent and impact, she said softly. You work in management, Daniel. You know the difference. Claire exhaled a sound like surrender and impatience braided together. Perhaps we should take a breath. Margaret, could we just walk through the benefits the community has chef-prepared meals, daily check-ins, a shuttle to the museum you love? The director said they host poetry readings. We went on a tour last week. Margaret repeated, and the word tasted of betrayal. You toured without me. We wanted to save you the trouble, Claire replied, and even her kindness became an insult. Margaret looked out at the city. Below, headlights stitched rivers of light along the avenues. Somewhere down there, a bakery's ovens were firing a late shift. Nurse was tucking a blanket around a patient. A child was practicing scales on a piano with a stubborn left hand. Life went on without permission. She returned her gaze to the table. When your father died, she said to Daniel, we had 2 months' savings and a mortgage, and you with your feet already in 3 different sizes of shoes. I made lists. I sold the car. I learned to repair a leaky sink from a library book because the plumber wanted $80 just to knock on the door. I did not tour another life and decide it was easier. Daniel whispered, I know. And in his voice, the boy returned for a second, sincere, stunned by the scale of her effort. Claire set the pen down as if the ink itself had cooled. Nobody is saying you haven't done enough, she said. We're saying you don't have to keep doing everything alone. The line struck somewhere deep. For an instant, Margaret's chest tightened, not with anger, but with weariness, an old ache that lived in the space where applause should have been. She let herself feel it. Then she folded her napkin open on her lap, as if resetting the scene. "I will listen," she said, "but I will not be decided for." Claire nodded, smoothing a page with ceremonial care. She spoke of safety protocols and landscaped paths of emergency buttons, discreetly placed of gourmet soups and book clubs, and a wellness director named Eunice, who told funny stories. Margaret listened. She asked questions with the coolness she had learned at 100 PTA meetings, 1,000 doctor's appointments, a lifetime of being the person who stayed until the forms were signed. She noticed the gaps between Claire's phrases. She noticed the way Daniel kept glancing toward the kitchen door as if expecting a cue. When the third course arrived, tiny medallions of beef crowned with bright coins of charred scallion. The waiter made eye contact with Margaret as he placed the plate before her. There was a flicker of recognition there, a puzzle piece turning. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then thought better of it and retreated. The kitchen door closed behind him with a soft hush of velvet. Something was gathering. Margaret felt it as surely as she felt the change in weather before rain. She thought of the scarf in her bag, a gift waiting for a moment that might never come. She thought of the pencil lines on the wall of the old hallway, the incremental heights of a boy who had once believed that the world rose only as high as his mother's reach. After dinner, Claire was saying we can go over the signatures. No pressure tonight, of course. Just next steps. Next steps, Margaret repeated, and she let the phrase settle like dust. She set her fork down, straightened in her chair, and looked at her son until he raised his gaze to meet hers. "Daniel. If there are to be steps," she said quietly, "I will take them myself." He opened his mouth, closed it. The room seemed to lean closer, the ambient chatter receding to a distant surf. From the kitchen, the clink of plates took on a rhythm like a countdown. And then, just as the balance of the evening teetered, the lights near the bar dimmed a fraction, and a small cluster of staff formed by the pastry station. The young waiter was among them, his expression transformed by certainty. He whispered to the maitre d', gestured once-twice toward their table, and vanished through a swinging door as if stepping directly into memory. Margaret's breath caught. The air smelled suddenly of vanilla and cocoa and something rarer, something like the past arriving in its Sunday best. The hum of conversation in the restaurant carried on as though nothing unusual lingered in the corner booth by the window. Couples clinked glasses. A group at the far end broke into laughter so loud it made the chandeliers tremble. But at Margaret's table, time slowed to a heavy crawl. The candle flame shivered against her face, cutting shadows across the lines time had carved there. Daniel's eyes flicked down to the untouched papers. Claire adjusted her napkin with the precision of a surgeon preparing for an incision. Margaret felt as though she were standing at the edge of an invisible cliff. She could hear the rush of her own heartbeat, steady and insistent, like drums, summoning her to battle. For all their soft words, safety, convenience, care, the truth had uncoiled itself fully now. Her son and daughter-in-law were prepared to take her life not in years, but in freedom. She reached for her water, her hand trembling just enough to betray her. The glass touched her lips, cool and sharp, and she swallowed slowly, letting the chill steel her resolve. She had faced worse letters from debt collectors, doctors shaking their heads gravely nights when she lay awake with the question of whether Daniel would ever know the scope of her sacrifices. But betrayal at her own table, dressed in silk and candlelight, that was a wound she had not prepared for. Claire leaned in, her voice lower now, almost conspiratorial. "Margaret, we know this feels sudden, but we didn't want to worry you with details until everything was in place. Sometimes decisions are kinder when they're made for you." Margaret set the glass down with deliberate care. "Kinder," she repeated softly. "That's the word you use for cages dressed up as homes." Daniel winced. "Mom, it's not like that. These places aren't what they used to be. They're resorts," she cut in her tone, sharp enough to slice. "Cruises that never set sail. Gardens and poetry readings to distract you from the fact that your own family doesn't want you in their house." Her son's face flushed. "It's not that we don't want you, it's just we can't. Our lives are so busy and Claire has her career and you," she asked, her voice trembling with both fury and grief. "What do you have, Daniel? A life too crowded for the woman who gave you yours." The words landed like stones. Daniel's lips parted, then pressed shut, his jaw tightening, as if he had bitten down on guilt itself. Claire's hand reached for his, covering it with practiced grace. "Margaret," she said smoothly, "no one is questioning what you've done, but there comes a time when independence becomes a danger, not a strength." Margaret looked at her daughter-in-law, at the flawless skin, the calculated poise, the way her every word sounded rehearsed. She wondered if Claire had practiced this speech in the mirror, her reflection nodding back in agreement. Did she believe it? Or was it just convenient to package cruelty in the wrapping paper of concern? Her gaze dropped again to the documents, legalese swimming on the page, signatures waiting like vultures. Power of attorney, transfer of residence, consent for medical oversight. Each sheet bore the weight of finality, and all of it had been prepared without her knowledge. A memory rose unbidden, clear as though summoned by the cruelty before her. Daniel at 12, pale and sweating with fever, his body racked with chills. She had sat by his bed for 3 nights, spooning broth past his lips, pressing cool cloths to his forehead, whispering stories so he would not slip away into the dark. On the 3rd night, he had clutched her hand and mumbled, "Don't leave me, Mom." The words had broken her heart and mended it all at once. She had vowed then that she never would. And now here he sat, leaving her with a pen stroke. The knife of betrayal twisted deeper. She leaned back in her chair, the pearls at her neck suddenly heavy, as if her late husband's memory were weighing her down. "Tell me, Daniel." She said, her voice brittle but steady. "Did you think of me when you signed the first line of those forms, or were you thinking only of yourselves, your space, your peace, your freedom?" Daniel's shoulders sagged, shame flickering across his features, but Claire's expression did not waver. "We thought of what was realistic," she said crisply, "and yes, of what was best for us too. But that doesn't make it wrong. Families adapt, roles change. It's the natural order." Margaret almost laughed, but it was a sound too sharp to be mistaken for humor. "Natural order," she echoed. "Is it natural to discard the roots that fed you, to prune the tree, because it has grown old?" She saw Daniel's eyes glisten faintly in the candlelight. He looked away out the window down at the street where tiny headlights crawled like fireflies. He could not meet her gaze because he knew the truth. He had been raised by the strength she now held like a shield. The piano's notes shifted slow and haunting, as though the musician had tapped into the current of grief running beneath her table. Margaret folded her hands in her lap, gathering herself. She would not weep. Not here, not before them. She would stand her ground with the dignity she had earned through years of sacrifice. And then, just as the silence pressed close enough to choke them, the kitchen doors swung open. The young waiter appeared again, his arms cradling a cake, alight with tiny flames. The room seemed to hush for a moment, as though time itself paused to witness. The cake was simple, unfashionable, among the elaborate desserts of the evening, a round chocolate sponge, rich and heavy with buttercream frosting, piped in uneven swirls. But Margaret recognized it instantly. Her breath caught. That cake was hers. Years ago, she had ordered it for Daniel's 12th birthday, scraped together from overtime wages and loose change in a jar. She had asked the bakery to write a message on top in careful icing. "Thank you, Mom, for your sacrifices." She had insisted on that inscription herself, imagining Daniel one day old enough to read it and understand the weight of the words. Now here it was again, unchanged, as if time had folded in on itself and delivered her proof. The waiter set the cake gently in the center of the table. The flickering candles cast golden light across the message, iced in white, every letter shimmering like a revelation. He placed beside it a small envelope yellowed with age, sealed with wax. "This was found in our archives," he explained quietly, his voice carrying just enough for the table to hear. "It was labeled, 'Under your name, ma'am.' The baker who retired last year left a note to deliver it, should anyone from your family ever dine here. Claire's smile faltered. Daniel's eyes widened. Margaret's heart surged with something fierce and unyielding. In that moment, the power shifted. The cake sat like an artifact from another life, its candles flickering in defiance of time itself. The restaurant seemed to lean toward the table, every gaze magnetized by the oddity of the moment. Waiters paused mid-step, conversations faltered, and the piano player's hands hovered above the keys as if the melody itself held its breath. Daniel stared at the inscription as though it were written in fire. Claire's composure cracked the faintest fissure in her perfect smile, her fingers tightening around the pen that still lay on the papers like a dagger waiting to strike. And Margaret felt the air change inside her lungs. The heaviness that had pressed against her chest all evening lifted, replaced by something molten and unshakable. She reached for the small envelope resting against the cake plate. The wax seal broke with a soft snap, and she unfolded the letter slowly, deliberately, as though conducting a ceremony older than the building itself. Her eyes traced the faded ink, her lips pressing together as she read, and then she lifted her gaze not to Daniel, not to Claire, but to the room. My son was 12 years old when I asked the baker here to inscribe these words, she said, her voice low but ringing clear across the hushed restaurant. I asked for them, not because he wrote them, but because I believed someday he would live them. She held up the letter, yellowed and fragile. And here it is, waiting in the shadows of time, reminding me of the truth that sacrifice is not erased by age, and love is not dismissed by convenience. The diners nearest to her leaned in, wide-eyed, their forks frozen mid-air. A murmur rippled outward as the weight of her words spread like concentric rings on water. Daniel swallowed his voice, breaking the stillness. Mom. But Margaret did not yield him her attention, not yet. She set the letter gently on the table beside the papers, the two stacks side by side, one born of love, the other born of calculation. The contrast was damning. You bring me here with contracts and signatures, she continued, thinking to tuck me away as neatly as these pages. You call it care. You call it kindness. But what I see is cowardice, a child grown too busy to remember the hands that lifted him, the nights I went hungry so he could eat, the years I bent my back so he could stand tall. Her words struck like hammers. Daniel bowed his head, shame blazing in the red of his cheeks. Claire, however, raised her chin, forcing steel into her tone. Margaret, this spectacle helps no one. You're embarrassing yourself. Am I? Margaret asked, and her eyes glinted. She gestured toward the cake, its candles still burning, the message glowing like scripture. Or are you embarrassed because the truth refuses to stay buried, because the very walls of this place remember my love for my son more clearly than you do? The crowd reacted, whispers flared, shocked glances passed between tables. Margaret let the moment swell, using it like a current. She reached for the knife set neatly beside the cake. With steady hands, she sliced the first piece, the blade sliding cleanly through layers of chocolate and buttercream. She set the slice onto a plate and pushed it across the table toward Daniel. Eat, she said simply. Taste what I gave you once when the world was smaller, but our bond was larger. Remember who I am and who you are, because of me. Daniel's hands trembled as he accepted the plate. He stared at the slice as if it were both salvation and condemnation. Slowly, almost reverently, he lifted the fork and took a bite. The sweetness filled his mouth and his eyes glistened. A choked sound escaped him, a memory rising with the flavor of boyhood birthday. His mother's tired smile lit by candlelight. Claire shifted uncomfortably, sensing her grip loosening. This doesn't change the reality, she insisted, though her voice faltered under the weight of the watching crowd. She still needs care. She still can't. Margaret turned to her with a calm that cut deeper than fury. And who appointed you the judge of what I need you, who never bore the weight of a family in your arms, you who mistake control for compassion? Claire blanched, her retort dying on her lips. Around them, the room was no longer neutral ground. It had become a tribunal, its jury composed of strangers, whose gazes condemned the younger couple with silent judgment. Margaret stood, her chair scraped back sharp as a gavel. She drew herself tall, her pearl necklace catching the candlelight. I am not a burden to be managed. I am not a problem to be solved. I am a mother, a woman who has given everything and who deserves not banishment, but respect. Applause began softly from the corner table, where an elderly couple clutched hands. Then another from a man in a suit who raised his glass in salute. The sound grew, spreading across the room until the restaurant pulsed with it, a standing ovation for a woman who refused to be diminished. Daniel looked up, tears streaking his face. His voice cracked. "Mom, I didn't mean." But Margaret held up a hand, silencing him gently but firmly. Intent and impact, she said, repeating the lesson she had already given him. Tonight the impact is clear. She turned to the waiter who lingered nearby, his young face alight with admiration. "Would you kindly box the rest of this cake? I'll take it home. It belongs in my kitchen, not as a prop in their performance." The waiter nodded with something like reverence, whisking the cake away with care. The diner's applause swelled one final time before fading back into murmurs and soft conversation. But the energy in the air remained transformed. Margaret gathered her handbag, the scarf still tucked inside, never given, and placed it firmly over her arm. She looked once at her son, then at the woman who sat beside him. Pale and silent, and she said, "I will not sign your papers. Not now, not ever. And if you cannot bear the weight of a mother's presence, then it is you, not I, who must find another home." With that, she turned and walked toward the door. Each step was deliberate, regal, as though the carpet itself bent to carry her forward. The restaurant seemed to part for her strangers, bowing their heads slightly as she passed the music, resuming with a new fervor. Behind her, Daniel sat, broken a fork still trembling in his hand, his slice of cake half eaten. Claire's mask had shattered entirely, her face pale with the knowledge that she had lost not just control of the evening, but the respect of everyone who had witnessed it. And Margaret, she did not look back. For the first time in years, her spine was unburdened, her steps steady, her heart blazing with the knowledge that she had reclaimed herself. The night air met her like a balm, cool, fragrant with the faint sweetness of city blossoms carried on the breeze. Outside the restaurant, the world moved on in its ceaseless rhythm. Taxis honked neon lights, flickered, strangers hurried past with their own burdens. Yet for Margaret, every sound felt sharpened, every color brighter. The heaviness that had pressed on her chest throughout dinner was gone, replaced by a quiet fire that spread through her veins. She paused just beyond the door, adjusting the strap of her handbag, her breath rising in small clouds. The pearls at her neck gleamed faintly in the lamplight, tokens of a life once filled with laughter and shared dreams. She had worn them tonight for her son, hoping he might remember who she was. Instead, she had remembered for herself. Behind her, the door swung open. Daniel stepped out, his face pale, his eyes red-rimmed. He lingered for a moment, uncertain, as though the simple act of approaching his mother had become a mountain too steep to climb. "Mom," he called softly, his voice carrying across the quiet stretch of pavement. Margaret turned slowly. Her gaze settled on him, not unkind, but resolute. "Daniel." He swallowed hard, his hands twisting together like a boy caught in some mischief. "I'm sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. His voice cracked, and the words splintered into silence. "You were thinking of yourself," Margaret said evenly, "and perhaps of convenience, but not of me." She held his gaze, letting the weight of truth settle between them. "I raised you to stand tall, not to shrink when duty grew heavy. Tonight you showed me how far you've wandered from the boy who once clung to my hand." Daniel's shoulders sagged. A tear slipped down his cheek, quick and hot. "I didn't mean to betray you. I thought I was protecting you." "Protection," she repeated softly, "is not stripping someone of their voice. Protection is standing beside them, not deciding for them. When you were sick at 12, burning with fever, I stayed awake 3 nights straight. Did I decide you were too weak to live? No, I believed in you. And you lived. The words cut him deeper than anger could have. He bent his head, his breath catching in ragged gasps. For a long moment he was silent, and Margaret let him stand in that silence because some lessons required stillness to sink in. At last he lifted his eyes, shimmering with regret. What do I do now, Mom? Margaret considered him. The boy she had raised flickered faintly in the man's sorrowful face. You remember, she said. You remember who you are and who I am. You learn to walk beside me, again, not ahead, not behind. And if you cannot, then you learn to live with the distance you create. From inside the restaurant, music drifted faintly through the doors, a melody both mournful and triumphant. Daniel stepped closer, but Margaret held her ground. Not tonight, she said firmly. Tonight, I walk alone. He stopped the rejection slicing, but deserved. Slowly he nodded. I understand. She inclined her head, then turned and began walking down the street. Each step echoed on the pavement, measured and sure. For the first time in years, she did not wonder if she was seen. She knew she was. She had made herself undeniable. Across the street, passers-by glanced at her, an older woman with dignity stitched into every line of her posture, her pearls gleaming, her chin lifted. None of them knew her story, yet in her bearing, they recognized strength. A few even smiled faintly as if touched by a grace they could not name. When she reached the corner, she paused at a bakery's window. Inside, racks of bread cooled in neat rows, steam fogging the glass. She remembered the years she had passed such windows, unable to afford the simplest treat for herself, saving every coin for Daniel's needs. And now, standing there with the taste of victory on her tongue, she realized something profound. She had always been more than what anyone else decided for her. She stepped into the bakery, greeted by the warm aroma of flour and sugar. The young clerk behind the counter looked up surprised to see someone so elegantly dressed at such an hour. Evening, ma'am. What can I get you? Margaret smiled, a small, steady curve of her lips. A slice of cake, she said. Chocolate if you have it. The clerk nodded and hurried to fetch it. When he set the plate before her, she sat at a small corner table, the bell above the door chiming faintly as another customer entered. Alone, but not lonely, she lifted her fork and took the first bite. Sweetness melted on her tongue, and for once it belonged entirely to her. Back at the restaurant, Daniel remained at the door, staring into the night where his mother had disappeared. Claire stood behind him, her face taut with anger and humiliation. She's made a fool of us, Claire hissed. Daniel shook his head slowly, his eyes still wet. No, she's reminded me who she is, and who I should be. Claire blinked, startled by the firmness in his tone. But Daniel did not explain further. He only turned back toward the city lights, guilt and memory heavy on his shoulders. Somewhere deep inside, the taste of chocolate lingered, mingled with the memory of candles and a card, written in icing, and a mother who had given everything. Margaret finished her cake rose and left the bakery. The night was hers, now uncertain, yes, but unbroken. She walked toward the horizon, her shadow long and proud beneath the street lamps, a silhouette carved in resilience. She did not need applause, nor pity, nor even forgiveness. She needed only her truth, and she carried it with her like armor. And in that truth, she was free. Stories do not end in restaurants or on street corners. They echo long after the scene has faded. Margaret's walk into the night was not the closing of a chapter, but the beginning of a truth made visible. And though the city swallowed her silhouette, her story lingered in her son's conscience, in the whispers of strangers who had witnessed her stand, and in the timeless bond between sacrifice and memory. For Daniel, the taste of chocolate would haunt him. Long after the candles were extinguished, he would remember the sweetness mixed with guilt, each bite reminding him of the mother who had carried him when he could not carry himself. He would see her face steady and unyielding and know that his choice had brought him to a crossroads. One path led back to her, to humility, apology, and rediscovery of love. The other led further away into a life built on convenience, but hollowed by regret. That choice would define him as much as his career or marriage ever could. For Claire, the evening was a reckoning of another kind. She had walked into the restaurant certain of her control, the papers sharp and ready like a hidden blade. But she left, diminished, her voice drowned out by the applause of strangers who had seen through her polished armor. Whether she learned from that humiliation or hardened further would be her own burden to bear. Margaret had not fought Claire. That night she had simply revealed her. And for Margaret herself, the lesson was less revelation than reminder. She had always known her worth, though years of solitude and neglect had tried to convince her otherwise. What she rediscovered that night was not power newly given, but power that had never left her. The cake, the letter, the applause. These were not gifts from the world, but mirrors held up to reflect what she already carried: dignity, sacrifice, and a love that no document could erase. In every society, stories like Margaret's repeat themselves quietly. Children grow, and in the press of ambition and convenience, they forget the long nights and silent sacrifices that built the floor beneath their feet. Mothers and fathers are tucked away in homes sometimes, with kindness, often with haste, and the world calls it progress. But beneath that progress lies a question. Too many are afraid to ask what becomes of love when it is reduced to paperwork. Margaret's stand was more than a defense of her independence. It was a declaration that memory must matter, that sacrifices do not expire when the hair turns silver or the hands grow unsteady, that gratitude is not seasonal, but lifelong. She did not ask for worship, only respect. She did not demand repayment, only recognition. And in demanding it, she reminded everyone who witnessed her, both in that restaurant and beyond, that the measure of a life is not found in convenience, but in honor. The image of her walking alone into the night becomes then a parable, not of loneliness, but of resilience. She was not abandoned. She chose to walk. She was not diminished. She rose above. And in her steps was a lesson for every son, every daughter, every spouse. Do not wait for a cake or a card or the applause of strangers to remember who raised you. Do not let your parents' sacrifices fade into the dust of your ambitions. For one day you too will walk in their shoes, and you will pray that those who follow remember your steps. Perhaps Daniel will return to his mother's door humbled, holding the scarf she had once meant to give him. Perhaps he will find her knitting by the window or tending her plants, and he will kneel as he once did as a boy, pressing his head against her lap in wordless apology. Perhaps. The future is uncertain, but the seed was planted that night, the seed of remembrance watered by shame and love, waiting to grow. And Margaret. She did not need to know what tomorrow held. That night she had claimed her truth, and it was enough. She walked into her apartment, set the boxed cake carefully on the counter, and let the silence of her home wrap around her like a cloak. She cut herself another slice, brewed a cup of tea, and sat by the window where the city lights burned. Alone, she lifted her fork and smiled, not because everything was fixed, but because she had fixed herself. Her story closes not with victory trumpets, but with quiet strength. The strength of a mother who, when faced with betrayal, turned memory into weapon sacrifice, into shield, and love into undeniable proof. A strength that every viewer, every listener, carries within themselves, waiting only for the moment it must rise. So let us carry Margaret's lesson with us, honor those who raised us not with empty gestures or polite excuses, but with the living proof of gratitude. Because love once given so freely deserves nothing less than respect in return. And if you forget, if the rush of life blinds you to the sacrifices that built your foundation, remember the cake, the card, and the mother who refused to be silenced. Remember Margaret.